The job should have been as easy as pie, abducting a human woman, living reclusively in a remote colony, with lax security and seemingly unimportant. Captain Kaelen, a seasoned veteran, had undertaken far more dangerous missions, raiding heavily armed transport ships, smuggling weapons past the intergalactic patrol, and taking on assignments that would make most people's skin crawl. Compared to those, this operation was child's play, a clean abduction, a ransom message, and a swift payout. Piece of cake. His crew acted chotka and efficiently, descending upon the small farmstead under the cover of night. Elara Vance, the woman they targeted, didn't scream or resist like typical hostages. She simply looked at them, blinked once, and obediently allowed herself to be led onto the ship. Even when her hands were bound and she was confined in the dimly lit cargo hold, Elara showed no fear. She merely glanced around, sighed, and muttered, "Well, this is inconvenient." That was the first moment Kaelen sensed something was amiss. Most hostages would either plead, scream, or threaten legal repercussions. Elara did none of the above. In fact, she seemed utterly indifferent to her current predicament. She made no attempt to ask what they wanted, who they were, or how she could buy her way out. Instead, she had the audacity to ask point blank, "Do you guys have coffee on this ship? If I'm going to be here for a while, the least I could ask for is a cup." The crew was stunned, exchanging bewildered glances. Jax, their technician, hesitantly replied, "We have Cybrew." He wasn't even sure why he answered her. Elara wrinkled her nose. "That's not coffee." She shifted in her restraints, clearly unimpressed. "You guys really need to upgrade your supplies." Kaelen frowned. He was not about to let some Earth woman dictate terms in this operation. "You'll be out of here soon enough," he snapped. "Just sit tight." She leaned back against the metal wall, looking strangely comfortable. "Oh, I will," she said, "but you won't like it." The crew dismissed Elara's warning, or at least they tried to. They were preoccupied setting up the ransom transmission to the Earth Council, expecting a response within hours. But soon after, minor, inexplicable malfunctions began to occur. The first issue was trivial, a flickering light in the cockpit. Then, the engine room door jammed for no apparent reason. Kaelen blamed it on poor maintenance, until the ship's AI started issuing conflicting status reports, sometimes claiming they were in hyperspace when they weren't, other times autonomously activating security measures. Jax, who prided himself on knowing the ship's systems better than anyone, grew increasingly uneasy. "Something's not right," he muttered as he tried to recalibrate the sensors. "Fix it," Kaelen ordered. "I'm trying," Jax retorted irritably, hammering at the control panel. It's like the ship doesn't know what's real anymore. Meanwhile, Elara remained silently seated in the cargo hold, softly humming a tune. When they finally completed the ransom message and prepared to transmit it, Elara spoke again. Her voice remained calm, but held an unsettling certainty. "You have about 12 hours before you badly regret this." The crew ignored her once more. As time passed, the ship's malfunctions escalated. Lights flickered in peculiar rhythmic patterns that felt too deliberate to be mere glitches. Doors automatically sealed shut unexpectedly, trapping crew members in various sections of the ship. The temperature in the engine room fluctuated wildly, forcing the chief engineer to evacuate before being cooked alive. Jax became increasingly frantic. "What the hell is happening?" he muttered, staring at the stack of malfunction reports piling up on his screen. "There's something in our systems," the navigator whispered, "like a virus." "Impossible," Jax refuted. "We're on a closed network." Then, the strangest thing occurred. A signal, undetectable at first, began emanating from within the ship. It wasn't a distress beacon, nor an external transmission. It was something else, something deep within their own systems, something rewriting data at will. Jax frantically ran diagnostics, sweat beading on his forehead. It's like the ship is talking to itself," he finally uttered. Kaelen had no time for cryptic nonsense. Shut it down. I don't think I can. And it was at that moment Jax saw it on the security feed. Elara was in the cargo hold, looking directly at the camera. No fear, no anger, just a small, enigmatic smile. Kaelen stormed into the cargo hold, infuriated by this charade. "What in blazes are you doing?" he roared. Elara looked up at him, as if she had been expecting this confrontation all along. "I warned you," she stated simply. Kaelen had dealt with difficult hostages before. He knew when someone was bluffing, trying to appear tougher than they were. But Elara wasn't posturing. There was something in her eyes, an unnatural calmness that was unsettling for someone in her situation. It sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "Tell me what you did." Elara tilted her head, regarding him as if he were the one in trouble. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You did. You kidnapped me." The overhead lights flickered again, this time pulsing in a sequence that almost felt like mocking laughter. And for the first time since this job began, Kaelen felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. The ship was breaking down, and no one could explain why. The Iron Hound was an old but reliable warship, hardened by years of mercenary work and built to withstand deep space battles. It had survived torpedo hits, plasma storms, and a near miss with a black hole. Yet, in the past few hours, it had devolved into a haunted house of mechanical failures and inexplicable malfunctions. Doors sealed and unsealed at random. Artificial gravity flickered off for seconds at a time, sending crew members tumbling before reactivating as if nothing had happened. The temperature in the mess hall plummeted below freezing, while the cockpit became stiflingly hot. And then, there were the whispers. Initially, the crew dismissed them as the ship's ventilation system, tricks of the air ducts carrying sound from one end of the corridor to another. But the voices weren't their own, and the words were in no known language. Jax sat hunched over the control panel, his fingers trembling as he ran another diagnostic. "This is impossible," he mumbled. "None of this is possible." Kaelen stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "Fix it. I'm trying." Jax snapped back, sweat dripping from his temples. "But it's like the ship is changing itself. I don't know how ships don't just change themselves." Kaelen growled. Jax didn't reply. He didn't need to. The evidence was staring them in the face. Systems flickering between states, as if something was rewriting them in real time. And then, as if the ship wanted to escalate the situation, an alarm blared. The navigator cursed and slammed a fist onto the console. "We're transmitting a signal." Kaelen's blood ran cold. "What signal?" Jax frantically manipulated the controls, but there was no source, no transmission request, no identifiable beacon. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice shaking. "It's coming from inside the ship." The crew exchanged glances, a palpable unease settling in the air like a lead weight. In the cargo hold, Elara remained seated, hands still bound, her expression unreadable. When Kaelen burst in, his temper barely contained, she was already looking towards the door as if she had anticipated his arrival. "What did you do?" he demanded. Elara sighed, tilting her head. "Still blaming me?" she asked. "Have you never considered the possibility that this isn't about what I've done, but about what you set in motion?" Kaelen clenched his fists. "Enough with the damn riddles. Either you tell me what's going on, or what?" Elara interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "You'll kill me? Throw me out the airlock." Her expression remained unchanged, but something in her eyes made his stomach churn. "You won't, and you can't." Kaelen opened his mouth to argue, but the ship answered for her. The lights went out completely, the hum of the engines ceased. For one terrifying moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the sensation of absolute emptiness pressing in around them. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting the cargo bay in an eerie red glow. From the hallway, someone screamed. Kaelen turned and sprinted towards the sound, heart pounding. When he reached the mess hall, his stomach plummeted. One of the crew members was gone. Not dead, not unconscious, simply gone. His tray of half-eaten food was still on the table, his chair knocked over as if he had stood up in haste. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, only emptiness. Jax was already at the control panel, scanning for life signs. "He's not on the ship," he whispered. Kaelen swallowed hard. "What do you mean, not on the ship?" "I mean the scanners can't find him." Jax hesitated, searching for the right word. "Missing." The remaining crew members were silent, strach, fear, crawling into their expressions, settling deep into their bones. Another scream echoed through the ship. They rushed towards the sound, but when they arrived at the engineering bay, another crew member was gone. No sign of struggle, no alarm, just missing. Elara's earlier words reverberated in Kaelen's mind. "I warned you." He turned back to the cargo bay. Elara was standing now. Somehow, she had freed herself from the restraints, even though no one had undone them. She rolled her shoulders as if just waking from a nap, then gave Kaelen a small, knowing smile. "Maybe now you should start listening to me," she said. Kaelen's throat was parched. He wanted to shout, demand answers, threaten her into explaining what was happening, but for the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. He was no longer in control, and he hated it. Jax awoke into Shana, silence. Not the normal kind of silence found in deep space. The soft hum of the ship's engines, the distant whir of ventilation, the occasional beep of the navigation system. This was a silence that pressed against the skin, that made every breath feel too loud. Etihana, silence, that felt unnatural. His heart pounded. He sat up too quickly, hitting his head on the bunk above him, wincing in pain. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and listened. Nothing. That wasn't right. The Iron Hound had a crew of 14 at any given time. Someone should be moving around, talking, working. Even if the ship was still malfunctioning, there should have been some sign of life. Jax grabbed his jacket, hesitating before opening the door. His fingers hovered over the panel. Then he noticed something else. His breath was visible. The hallway beyond was cold, freezing, a stark contrast to the stifling heat in the cockpit just hours ago. He pressed the panel, and the door hissed open to reveal a dimly lit corridor bathed in red emergency lighting. Something about it made his skin crawl. Jax took a cautious step forward. His boots echoed too loudly against the metal floor. Instinct told him to turn back, to stay in his room and wait this nightmare out. But he wasn't that kind of man. He needed to know what was happening. As he walked, he passed by rooms that should have been occupied, but weren't. Crew quarters were open, untouched. The mess hall was empty, food trays still sitting where they'd been left. The engineering bay was silent. The ship was abandoned. But that was impossible. Jax reached the security hub, hoping for answers. He brought up the camera feeds, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the screens. Every room was empty, every single one. The crew had vanished. They had an abandoned ship. There were no lifeboats missing, no signs of forced entry or exit. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Jax's pulse thundered in his ears. Then, movement. A single figure on one of the feeds. Elara. She was standing in the middle of the cargo bay, looking directly into the camera, as if she knew Jax was watching. She smiled. Jax slammed the console off and stumbled backward, his breathing ragged, his mind racing. Impossible, no logical explanation. He had spent years working with mercenaries, pirates, and smugglers. He had seen things most people wouldn't believe. But this was something different, a presence, a force, something beyond reason. And it was inside their ship. Jax forced himself to move, rushing towards the Bulba bridge. He had to find Kaelen. If anyone was left, it had to be the captain. He found Kaelen exactly where he expected, sitting in the command chair, gripping the armrests as if trying to keep himself from falling apart. His eyes were locked on the view outside. Jax followed his gaze. The stars were wrong. They weren't in hyperspace. They weren't even in known space. The patterns, the constellations, none of them matched any star charts Jax had ever seen. Captain, she's not human. Jax blinked. What? Kaelen finally turned, and for the first time since Jax had known him, the man looked truly afraid. She told me, Kaelen said heavily. She told me we shouldn't have taken her. We didn't listen. He let out a bitter laugh, hollow and exhausted. Now she's making sure we understand. Jax took an unsteady breath. Where's the crew? Kaelen shook his head. Gone. The word hit like a blow to the stomach. Gone where? Jax pressed, as if demanding an answer would somehow make it less terrifying. I don't know, Kaelen admitted, but she does. A shiver ran down Jax's spine. We have to do something. Do what? Kaelen snapped. Open fire? Jettison her into space? You think that'll stop her? Jax clenched his jaw. We can't just. You really should have listened. A voice interrupted them. They turned as one. Elara stood in the doorway of the Bulaba bridge, her hair slightly tousled, her expression serene, her stance relaxed. But there was something about her that made the air feel heavier, a presence that filled the room though she barely moved. Jax took an instinctive step back. Kaelen, to his credit, stayed seated, though his knuckles turned white where he gripped the chair. What are you? He asked, his voice hoarse. Elara smiled. That's the wrong question. The emergency lights flickered, the ship groaned, metal bending, whispering, breathing. Jax felt the shift in the air, static crackling in his bones. The ship was no longer theirs. It hadn't been for a while. Elara stepped forward, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. You took something you shouldn't have, she said softly, and now you're paying for it. Jax swallowed hard. The crew, they're elsewhere, she said. They'll stay there. Kaelen's voice was barely a whisper. And us. Elara tilted her head, considering, then she smiled again, and it was somehow worse than if she had looked angry. That depends, she said. How smart are you willing to be? The lights went out again, and the Iron Hound shuddered as something changed. The ship trembled beneath their feet. The walls groaned like something alive, something ancient and restless, stretching against the constraints of metal and circuits. The dim red glow of emergency lighting flickered uncertainly, casting shifting shadows across the Bulaba bridge. Jax clutched the console, his breath shallow. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and frantic. He wasn't sure if it was just panic, or if the ship itself was amplifying the sound, letting it bounce back at him, mocking his fear. Kaelen remained in his chair, unmoving, staring at Elara as if sheer force of will could change anything. But his fingers gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Elara exhaled, slow and deliberate. You're thinking of attacking me, she said, her tone almost amused. A desperate last attempt, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if you throw everything you have at me, you can win. Jax didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had been considering it. Grabbing the nearest weapon, overriding the security lockdown, blowing the cargo bay doors open, whatever it took. But the more he looked at Elara, the more he realized how pointless that idea was. She wasn't scared. She wasn't worried. She wasn't even angry. She was waiting. What are you? Jax finally whispered. Elara tilted her head, thoughtful, as if deciding how much to reveal. I was human once, she said, a long time ago. The ship groaned again, a deep, resonating sound, as if reacting to her words. Not anymore. Jax felt something shift beneath his feet. It wasn't gravity. It was something else, something deeper, a sensation of wrongness, as if the ship wasn't entirely here anymore. We have to get out, he whispered. Kaelen snapped his head towards him. Get out where? Escape pods, Jax said quickly. We take one, leave the ship, get as far from her as possible. Kaelen didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched. Then slowly he nodded. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting for whatever came next. Elara sighed, almost disappointed. You're thinking too small, she said. But if that's the choice you want to make, go ahead. Jax didn't wait for her to change her mind. He grabbed Kaelen's arm, dragging him towards the exit. They sprinted down the corridor, feet pounding against the metal floor. The ship twisted around them, the corridors feeling longer, stretched, as if reality itself was bending to keep them from leaving. Jax shoved those thoughts aside. He reached the escape pod bay and slammed his hand against the release panel. Nothing. No, 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 he muttered, trying again. The screen flickered, then displayed 2 words in stark red. Access denied. Jax swore. She's locked them. Kaelen pulled out his sidearm and fired at the control panel. Sparks flew, but the doors remained sealed behind them. Footsteps. Slow, unhurried. Elara. Jax turned to face her, his pulse hammering. She stopped a few feet away, watching them with something close to curiosity. You keep trying to fight me, she said. I don't understand why. Because we're not just going to let you kill us. Kaelen growled. Elara laughed. It was soft, but it wasn't cruel. If anything, she sounded genuinely amused. Who said I was going to kill you? Jax's mouth went dry. He realized she hadn't harmed them at all. The crew was missing, yes, but there had been no blood, no screams, just vanishing. What did you do to them? He asked. They're not dead, Elara said. They're just somewhere else. Jax clenched his fists. Where? Elara didn't answer. Instead, she took another step forward, looking directly at Kaelen. You've been playing in dangerous waters for a long time, Captain, she said. You take what you want, you don't ask questions, you think the galaxy is just full of things for the taking. Kaelen stiffened, but didn't deny it this time. You took something that wasn't meant to be taken, Elara continued. And now you understand. Jax inhaled sharply. That was your plan all along, wasn't it? He whispered. You wanted us to kidnap you? Elara turned to him and smiled. Very good, Jax. His stomach twisted. He didn't want to be right. Kaelen tensed, his voice tight. If you're not going to kill us, what do you want? Elara glanced at the sealed escape pods, then back at them. A choice. Jax exchanged a look with Kaelen. What kind of choice? He asked wearily. Elara took another step forward. The ship trembled around them, responding to her presence. You can stay, she said simply. Stay and see what's beyond, what your crew has already glimpsed. Kaelen's expression darkened. And if we don't? Elara's smile didn't fade. Then you leave. She gestured towards the escape pods. The red, access denied, text flickered then disappeared. The doors opened with a hiss. Jax stared. He didn't trust it, but what other option did they have? Kaelen squared his jaw. And the crew, he demanded. What happens to them? Elara's expression softened, but it was unreadable. They made their choices. Kaelen exhaled through his nose. He turned to Jax. We're leaving. Jax didn't argue. They stepped into the escape pod, sealing the hatch behind them. The ship trembled one last time, like a final warning. Elara watched them through the window as they launched. Jax expected something to happen, some last-minute trick, some final horror. But as the Iron Hound shrank into the distance, nothing pursued them. Nothing needed to, because as the ship disappeared from sight, Jax realized he would never forget the look in Elara's eyes. She hadn't won. She had never been playing their game to begin with. The patrol vessel Argus picked up the escape pod adrift in deep space. The crew had expected wreckage, maybe a distress signal, or at worst, bodies. Instead, they found a single survivor. Jax. When they pulled him aboard, he was barely responsive. His clothes were damp with sweat, his pupils wide, his skin pallid. He mumbled incoherent phrases as the medics scanned him. The pod's flight logs were intact, but what they found made no sense. There should have been 2 passengers, but only one was inside. Captain Vasquez of the Argus reviewed the data with a deep frown. Where's the other one? Jax's breathing hitched. He looked up at her, his expression distant, unfocused. He hadn't spoken properly since they found him. Finally, his lips parted. He stayed. Vasquez frowned. Who stayed? Jax flinched at the name, his fingers clenched into fists. Captain Kaelen. He stayed. It was the only answer he would give. Vasquez exhaled sharply, glancing at her crew. No one spoke, but the unease was clear in their eyes. Jax Vance wasn't a name that meant anything to them, but the Iron Hound was. And the Iron Hound was gone. They tried to scan for it, triangulate where the warship could have ended up, but it was as if it had never existed. The last registered location in its logs didn't match any known coordinates. Star charts didn't recognize the region. It was just nowhere. Vasquez ordered Jax to be placed under medical supervision. He wasn't physically injured, but something about him was off. His vital signs were erratic. His brain scans showed activity spikes that medics had no explanation for. He barely responded when they spoke to him, except when one question was asked. What happened to your crew? His breathing would quicken, his fingers would twitch, his eyes would lose focus. They're elsewhere. That was the only response he would give. After 3 days, the Earth Council got involved. Jax was debriefed extensively, but they extracted no useful information. His story, if it could even be called that, was incomplete. When pressed, his answers would become vague. She told us, he would say, or we took something we shouldn't have. And the one that sent chills through the interrogators. She let me go. There was never an explanation of who Elara Vance was. The Argus crew searched their records for any trace of Elara Vance, but there was nothing. No birth certificates, no planetary registry, no employment history. She simply didn't exist. The debriefing officers considered the possibility that Jax was Stradenia, suffering from psychosis, of deep space, that the loss of his crew had fractured his mind. It wouldn't be the first time a lone survivor returned with an impossible story. But then the ship logs came back. The Iron Hound, data had been wiped clean after a certain point. Not manually. There were no timestamps for deletions, no logs showing tampering. It was as if the last moments of the ship's existence had simply been erased, leaving only void. The technicians had seen data corruption before. They had seen intentional sabotage before. But this was different. They couldn't explain it. So they buried it. The Iron Hound was officially listed as lost beyond navigation range. The details of the case were secreted, classified, locked away in reports that would never see the public eye. Jax Vance was discharged from duty, deemed mentally unfit for service. He disappeared shortly afterward, refusing all financial support, all relocation offers. But the story of what happened aboard the Iron Hound didn't disappear with him. Rumors spread among mercenaries and smugglers, whispered in the shadowy corners of space stations, shared between wary captains before jobs that seemed too easy. Never take a human hostage unless you know exactly who they are, because sometimes they're not human at all.